Welcome to this training video of updates for Model Annotations by CMK BIM Consulting in March 2019. When you go back to the original link that I sent you after you purchased the applications to download the installers and the training videos, you'll see that there are new versions here that are going to be 0.3 or newer. Now, the first thing that's a big update that we did across the board on all of the different parts of the Model Annotations pack is that all of the objects that were created by Model Annotations had a start number of 1. We did give them special prefixes, but because I had a start series of 1, it was actually being considered during the numbering process, which on really, really large models, this might slow down the initial numbering a little bit. Now, instead of doing that, what we've done now is we've switched all of the start number series to -1, so that way it does not take effect during numbering. Whenever you put a negative number, it's not just that Tekla forces that mark, it's actually taking it out of the consideration for numbering. Now, one thing that's really important here, though, is for existing users that are using previous versions on their existing models, is that if you've already applied some of the components in the model using the previous versions, you install the new versions and start adding new annotations in the model, some of them will have the -1, some of them will have the 1. So if you're going to update in the middle of an existing model or an existing job, you need to go through and you're going to have to modify all of your existing annotations in the model so that way they get the -1. If you have a mix of start number 1 and -1, you're going to actually get an overlapping marks message during the numbering process from Tekla. So you either want to holistically wait till you get to the new job, or you just need to do the process of quickly modifying all your existing annotations so that way they update with the -1. Let me show you how. In the Model Annotation download directory or folder that I sent you, there's a new attributes folder here, which you can copy some of these files into your model attributes folder. For instance, here the one that we're going to be working with at the moment is this CMK Model Annotation selection filter. So you can copy that into your model attributes folder. That way you don't have to set this up manually. But then when I reopen the model, I can see here that I've got these filters that I can use to quickly find all the Model Annotations objects. Now up here at the top, we can do this a couple different ways. The first thing we can do is if we check all of these checkboxes here at the top, including the object type number being 4, press apply. We'll have select components down here, and then if we just window around the model or say Control A to highlight all the objects, this grabs pretty much all of the components, the annotations components. So if you wanted to be safe, if you haven't done a lot of work on your job, you can actually just delete everything. So this is how you wipe out all your components quickly in the model. Now we don't want to do that because we've done a lot of work here. I simply just want to update everything. So all you have to do is then use these other filters to do that. So instead of doing all these up on the top, you just uncheck these, and then one at a time, you'll have the object type 4 selected, then you'll have model marks selected here, and you'll press apply. And then when you do a Control A, that'll find all the model marks here in the model and only filter those out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the model mark properties open. So let's open that up. And here's a neat little trick is if you ever want to update all of your marks, but you don't want to change or modify any of the content on your dialog box, you just uncheck everything on the checkbox, have everything selected of your model marks in the model, and then let's just interrupt here. So everything is selected, and with everything unchecked here, you simply press modify, and then that updates. So nothing's going to get overridden as far as your part mark information or anything like that, your size, your positioning. It simply just goes through and it updates the mark content basically based on the beam that was read. So if you had anything numbering that was out of date, this is also a neat way to just update all your marks. But the nice thing about this is if we just go ahead and let's uncheck these so that way we can select the objects. When you do that, it now updates this numbering to -1. So you just repeat this process on the other object types. So let's do object type 4, and then let's go to model dimension this time. Press apply, and then I don't think I have any manual dimensions in the model. Oh, there we go. So this is part of that. So you can select those, and then you can just say, again, open up model dimension, uncheck all the checkboxes, press modify, and then that -1 will be updated. So you just have to do this once, at least on your existing models. If you're an existing user and you want to update all of your existing annotations to the -1 versus the 1. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the updates that were done to DimGrid. All right, so here we have a grid in the model, and it was actually set where the first elevation is at 100 foot versus 0. So this is pretty common. This happens quite a bit. And so one thing that the initial version of dim grid had is that it always put the plan dimensions in the overall at a 0 foot 0 or the base of the grid where the grid was created. If you're using the default grid out of the box and just entering 100 foot and taking out the 0 here, the actual coordinate system of the grid is still, believe it or not, down at 0, 0. So what I did is instead I still read the grid coordinate system, but then I read the first Z elevation value there, and that's where the dim grid elevations or plan dimensions are going to first be placed. So let me just show you this. I essentially select the grid, or activate the component here, dim grid, and it says pick the grid, then wait for the dimensions to appear. So we'll just go ahead and pick the grid, give it a few seconds here, and then here you'll now see that it no longer puts all the dimensions down at 0, 0 like it was before. It's actually putting the first elevation and the verticals as well as all the plan and overall dimensions now at 100 foot. Now we're going to review the changes done to model dimension. All right, let's go ahead and open up a second floor plan here. So I'll go to elevation 1, 10 foot 6. And let's just get in true plan view here. Now, one thing that users were saying with model dimension is that the traditional way that you input the model dimension is you have to sort of pick the origin and the UCS to align the actual dimensions. And so what this meant is you pick the origin, then you pick like a distance in the X direction and the Y direction, and then it says to start picking your dimension points. So here I would just pick, and then middle mouse button. Now, one thing to save a little bit of time on that is you can fill in all of your settings here and you can save them away, give it a name and save it away. And then when you open up the dialog box the next time, those save settings will appear here in the drop-down list. So let's say that I wanted to do some floor dimensions here. And instead of having to actually pick those 3 points, you can come up here and use the workplane tool. And so let's say that I just want to do some X dimensions here. So I'm going to pick right here and I'm basically setting the X, Y. So now when I do all this string of dimensions, I don't have to pick all those origins. So I just say apply dimensions in plane. And then what it does is it says press the middle mouse button or pick points and press the middle mouse button when done. So I just basically pick those. And again, if you mess up on any inputs, you just backspace. So let's get there, there, and then middle mouse button when I'm done. Now let's do the Y direction. So all we need to do is we need to just come in here and we go to workplane tool, and then I can hover over and we'll just do the Y direction this time. So we'll just say apply dimensions here, and let me cancel out of that. Apply dimensions. Okay, so it says pick dimension points and then middle mouse button when done. So now I can just pick in the Y axis, just pick a few different points there, middle mouse button, and then there we go. So this is just a quicker way for you to apply dimensions by changing the work plane really fast, if that's faster for you than actually picking the points to insert the origin or the UCS of the dimensions. Next, we'll hop into the updates done for ModelMark. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up the ModelMark properties, and I'm in my 100 foot elevation, so I'm only seeing the columns here. Basically this is just my 2D view at the base of the building. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up a steel column here for my selection filter. So let's do steel column, that way I'm only grabbing parts that are columns. And traditionally, what was there before is that you could apply the column marks and you can set whether it's at the start, center, end, or top or front face here. And so if we switch this to use those standard settings and say apply, what will happen is that you'll see that all of the column marks are pretty much appearing here lined up along the length of the column. Now this is okay for elevation view and probably just looking in 3D, but if I actually wanted to see this in the more traditional form, what we can do is we can use the new option for this. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to this, and then what I'm going to do is I've already saved away some settings called column, and all I really did is I increased the size here, and then there's this new plan and plan aligned. And what that means is it looks at the current work plane in plan that you're at and where the parts are at, and then it basically is just putting in those marks based on a true plan view. And this is really good for things like columns. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use the column settings, apply to the selected objects here. And now we get this nice traditional 45-degree looking kind of column call out, which is what we're used to seeing. Now you can still, let's switch our selection filter off. You can still grab this and you can still say whether you want it at the center or at the top of the column. So if I go back to my 3D view, we would actually see that this is moved up to the center. And then if we wanted it at the top, we could also do that. So just say modify. So you can do either one of those, and then we'll just go back to the base. Or the other neat thing here is that if we go back to this base elevation, let's go ahead and say get. We can, instead of plan, we can say plan aligned. And for columns, what this does is it actually reads the top flange and then the near side web or the front face in the local coordinate system, depending on how a column's rotated, and it marks it to this. So this is like if you are wanting to see the actual piece mark face that is traditionally used on columns, it's usually the top flange toward the bottom of the column, the left end or start end of the beam or the column there. And so we can see that that's set. So if we actually come over here into the properties and we modify this or rotate it, let's switch this, modify, you'll see that it actually moves around based on the column's orientation. So that way it's completely parametric. So again, you can either use plan or plan aligned for that on columns. Now, one other thing that was commonly happening here is that on things like channels and angles, where they're towed the opposite direction or they're rotated differently than traditional floor plan beams, you're getting kind of probably what look like weird looking marks. So let's just use the default standard settings here again. We'll just say standard, apply to selected, and you get some upside down marks and things, right? So we don't want that. We want this to be correct into the plan view. So to do that, we can do this a couple different ways. We can again select on these. So let's do plan just as an example, and we still want it to be towards the start end of the piece. But now I'm just going to activate the component, pick on the part, and then it puts that in there. So whenever the beam is coming from right to left or from right to left or top down, so it's kind of like going opposite direction of what you normally model. If you open this up, you'll see that there's this offset here, and that's just kind of putting this in so that way it looks a little bit more cleaned up. If something is done the opposite direction, what you can do is you can just come in here and say like negative 1 foot as an example, and it's going to kind of move it over towards, so it's still on the left or the start end of the beam, but it's just kind of offsetting it along this direction so that way it fits in there a little bit more nicely. This one's going from left to right, so let's just go ahead and put the positive value back in there. So let's do 9 as an example, activate model mark, and then there we go. So you can adjust the offset here to kind of tweak this. I'm going to probably make another model mark that actually is more like an associative note where you can kind of pick the origin and sort of pick like a second placement point or to get a little bit more control. But currently this is one thing that you can do for now. Now there's also an aligned option here. So if we want to uncheck everything and go back to just this plan aligned, and we just say modify on that, oops, let's check that, say modify, then basically it is still trying to follow like this here. It's 9 inches, but it's actually following the member. So let's say we want to increase this a little bit, increase that, say modify, see how it bumps it out a little bit. But what's nice about this is it stays, even though it's in the plan view, it does try to stay aligned with the part. So if we move this like to nearest, it'll still try to stay with that. But again, the difference between this versus just the standard front or top is if we use top here and then I say modify on this, then see how it's upside down because it's following the top face of the part, which is actually face downward because of the way we're towing the channel. So just something to keep an eye on, and this is really handy for angles and channels or plates even in the model where you're trying to apply the mark but it doesn't follow the standard like normal beam type properties. Next up, let's take a look at model elevation. Alright, so if we open up the model elevation dialog box here, nothing has really changed on the dialog box itself. The only thing that we've really updated here is that when you select on a bunch of beams and columns, there is this feature of apply elevations to selected. And so the whole idea here is that if I just use the standard and say apply, What it does is it reads the endpoints of the beams, it reads the current work plane in the model, which I've changed as you can see a little bit here, and then what it does is it puts in all of the elevation points aligned with that. So it just takes away the manual time of picking the X and Y alignment coordinates of putting in the elevations one at a time. Now, the only thing here is that in the previous version, what was happening is if you had these two beams were selected, it has kind of the shared same endpoint. And what it was doing is it was doubling up on the annotations. So now during this application process, what it does is it checks to see if something's already been inserted at that point or really close to that point. And if something's already been inserted, it doesn't duplicate that. And that's pretty important because you don't want to see actually a whole bunch of unnecessary objects added in the model. And if something did change, you don't want to have to deal with multiple instances of that mark. So that's the big change here specifically on model elevation. Now let's go ahead and take a look at model text. All right, so let's open up the model text dialog box here. And what was ended up happening quite a bit is that you had to pick the origin point, and then the x-axis, and then the y-axis. And so people were just they're doing that from scratch each time. Now there's a couple of tricks. Before this update, you could have just put in one note here, and then you could have just done a copy. So if you're doing a whole bunch of markups on the same kind of plane, you can easily just copy existing ones and then come back and modify them. Now, but just in case you're kind of going through and you wanted to more quickly put these in, again, if you change your work plane, so I'm going to use the work plane tool here. I changed the work plane to either the view or this current plan because I'm in a 2D floor plan elevation here. And so if we go back into the model text, the feature that's been added here is we're going to go ahead and interrupt because we're not going to put it in individually. There's this apply text in plane. So we'll use the saved away settings, anything that we've saved away up here. We can set that. And then we say apply text in plane. So now it just says pick the point to insert the text. So it's reading the current work plane and then it's automatically putting in the X, Y coordinates and stuff like that. So that way I don't have to kind of manually pick the X and the Y in order to get that in there. So that's just a neat little feature here is again, apply text in plane. So you have to change the work plane first so that way it knows exactly which elevation and which orientation that you want. But once you've got that set, you can do that. Another feature here is we've added this leader line yes or no. So if you say no, which is how it was before, or yes, it's going to read from the original picking point, and then based on these offsets here, you can say provide or verify dimensions or whatever, and then just say modify. And so then there it basically just provides that leader line so that way, it's easier to point out exactly what your node is about. Now, I've had a lot of users forget to set up their filters on their erection drawings or their general arrangement drawings in order to either hide all of the model marks or to set up object level settings so that way there's no part marks shown and they show up nice and cleanly on the drawing and you don't get this. If you forget to do this before you make the drawing will take forever to create because Tekla's going through the algorithm of trying to offset all those part marks and then it's just drawing and rendering all those objects. So it kills the drawing creation process as well as the opening process is extremely slow. So next I'm going to show you how to prevent this, and you can start with some of the settings that I've already created here for you. Okay, so let's say that we want to take this really good looking set of marks and everything that we've got on in the model here, and we want that to look nicely on the drawings and not have that Christmas tree. So the first thing is if you use a lot of the out-of-the-box settings to get started, like the saved away GA drawing settings that's called plan, then basically what you can do is you can take these settings that I've got here and you can copy these, and this is in the download of the installers and training videos of the Model Annotations pack. So you can download that, and then if you go in your model folder here, attributes, and then you can paste those in here, and I've already got them in there, so I'm just going to paste and replace there. Now be careful, if you've already customized your plan settings, don't copy these in there because I don't want to override any of your existing settings. Just bring in the solid fill, which you'll need that to make the text look solid, and then the other thing here was the filter name that we actually just created here. So let me go back to my other folder. That would be this CMK annotation. So this GDF, like this is a filter that we can actually use here for a general arrangement drawing. So that CMK annotation, and then copy this solid fill. And if you've already got plan settings and you don't want to overwrite them, then just ignore these files here. All right, so now once I've done that, I do need to reopen the model so that way these attributes are recognized. So I'm just going to go ahead and reopen here, and we'll save the model. And then that way we can actually create a general arrangement drawing using these settings. All right, so I'm going to go to Create Drawings, General Arrangement Drawing here, and then I'll go select my second floor plan. I'll go to Drawing Properties, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up Plan. So when I load this up, there's an Edit Settings here, and I've got this CMK annotation that's already been created here. And then what I can do is I can actually add another one. So let me show you first where the CMK annotation comes from, which is the filter. Then there's what category are we affecting. So there's going to be part mark, and then we're also going to do one for part. And then there's this no part mark, which already exists in the out-of-the-box US environment. So all I needed to do is use the CMK annotation. So where did that come from before we actually create the drawing? If I go to filter here and I go into my drop-down list, after we copied that attribute, there's this CMK annotation. So basically what this does is it says anything that's a part has a prefix equal to the lowercase CMKD, which is exactly what we've set on all the objects that are input for model annotations in the model, then that's going to make this filter true. So we're going to use that filter in order in the part mark properties to use this no mark. So we don't want any part marks to be displayed for any of those objects. So that's already been saved away. Then what I created is this under part presentation, I made this solid fill. So that's part of what you just copied into your model. It sets the presentation to exact, and then it sets the hatching here to solid filled, so that way it looks nice and good like text. All right, let's go back to edit settings. So I've already got the CMK annotation added in here, and then part mark and no part, but let's go ahead and add a part one in here. So I'm going to say add row, and then I'm going to move up. And I'm going to just move this up to the top because it does read from top to bottom, so I want it to be read first. And I'm going to use my CMK annotation filter. This is part presentation that we're controlling, and I'm going to say solid fill. So once that's all set up, I'm just going to go ahead and say apply, okay. And if you're doing this to your own settings, whether it's plan or elevation or whatever you want, you can apply these settings, get it all set, and then resave it away. And so now I've got those settings all set up. I'm going to go ahead and select my second floor plan here and create this drawing. Now this is going to go much faster than if you didn't have those filters and things already set. And what we'll actually see is I still have normal part marks on. So we're going to see both my part marks from the model as well as the normal Tekla marks appearing here. So this just gives you the flexibility. You can choose to use either one. And here I've got all the approver notes and all the part marks and dimensions shown. So if you would like to use the model annotations in your drawings, then this is how you can easily do that. Now let's say that you don't want to see any of this stuff here. Then what you can do is you can go to the filter, and then you can just say add a filter, and you can say anything that equals, let's see, so part, and we'll say prefix equals that CMKD, and then we just say modify. And so notice here this is actually showing all the objects, but we want it to be not that, right? So we'll just say anything that does not equal that, and we'll say modify. And there we go. Now it's just a pure J drawing. So this is the other way to do it. If you don't want to see any model annotations in your drawings at all, then just make sure that you set this filter of part prefix does not equal CMKD on the drawing level properties, and do that before you make your drawing, so that way none of those objects appear. Now, let's say that there are some cases where there's some annotations that I do want to appear here, and then there's other annotations that I don't. So some guys were saying, hey, I don't want to see any dimensions or see the piece marks from the model come in here, but I do want approval notes or any checking notes. So that way we can make sure RFIs are noted, etc. So you have to actually get rid of this filter if you're going to do that, because this will holistically filter all of the drawing based on this, and then none of the classifiers will work for those objects. So I'm going to delete this row, and then I'm going to go ahead and say modify here, and then what we'll see is that I've actually already set up the rule for this approver notes to appear, but then none of the other model annotations are appearing. So how did I do that? So what I did is I created a filter. So I go to CMK approval notes, and here it just says part finish equals approval notes. So I set this up and I saved it away, and I didn't hit modify on this drawing in any way. I just set up the filter, then I press cancel. Then from there, what I'm going to do is I go into the edit settings of that, so the object level settings, and I added this CMK approval notes item at the top, and then the CMK annotation, I just switched that to hidden for the object type. So I do have to have this CMK approval note, and I'm filtering by the object type of part and what settings I'm controlling, and then I'm using solid fill for that so it looks good like text. And then this other one here for the rest of the annotations, I'm switching to hidden. I have approval notes first because Tekla reads this from top to bottom. I want it to find the approval notes and filter that, and then everything else I want it to be filtered and set to hidden. So that pretty much shows you how you can do this, and then once this is set, you can say apply and save it away as your settings, and you're good to go. Now, again, how did I filter out these approver notes? If I go back into the filter here, let's go to approver notes. Here I say the finish field equals approver notes. So let's go back into the model to see what that means. So we'll close down the drawing here, and then I'll go back in, and then at the second floor I've got my component here, and within the component dialog box there's that ability to set the group name. So that group name there within these components, when it writes that, it writes it to the finish field of those objects that are created. So here you'll see that approval notes is written there, and I can use that as a filterable attribute on my GA drawings. Now I can see all the approver notes on my drawings, but I'm not seeing any of the dimensions or the text. So if you don't currently have a copy of Model Annotations, just contact us. And Model Annotations is on sale for $3.99 per user. And if you are an existing user and you have any further questions or any challenges, just feel free to contact us and we'll get you all set up and squared away.